Living so bright, you got to wear shades. Because we ended up last week where we finished with verse 10, and that is wrong. We're going to go through Ephesians 5:11 through 16 today. So with that said, what we reviewed last week is for you were once in darkness, but now you are light in the Lord, walk as children of light. And so hence kind of where I got my title today, Living So Bright, You Gotta Wear Shades, right? Okay? Because we talked about a few of the things that we needed to get rid of. Neither filthiness, nor foolish talking, nor coarse jesting, which are not fitting, but rather giving of things. And we knew that filthiness was obscenity, because this is the only place these are used in the New Testament. So filthiness is obscenities. The one that some of you enjoyed talking about is foolish talking, which is basically speaking without thinking. Boasting or exaggerating, or foolish promises that you have great intent to do, but you can't really have the time or the means to follow through. So it's something that we need to be careful of, that we don't overextend ourselves, because I know I'm guilty of that myself. All right? And then, of course, jesting is just vulgarity. Okay? So that's where we left off last week, and we talked about living the light, and so I want to continue that on. Let's look at verses Ephesians 5:11 through 16 today. And it says, "And have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather expose them. For it is shameful even to speak of those things which are done by them in secret. But all things that are exposed are made manifest by the light, for whatever makes manifest is light. Therefore he says, Awake, you who sleep, arise from the dead, and Christ will give you light. See then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time, because the days are evil." Okay, and so we've seen some of that stuff again. We had two sets of things that we needed to be putting off, and this one we covered first. And this is where I got to use that nice word, profligate, okay? And the reason why I bring this back is because we're going to see it again later in these verses, the same thing. And I get to use this picture again, okay? And it's reckless extravagance. So uncleanness in the Greek here is this reckless extravagance, and covetousness is the other end of the spectrum, where you want the things that somebody else is being recklessly extravagant about. This was from the movie Secondhand Lions, and they bought a boat with their money and put it in a pond that barely held the yacht, right? So that's the things we're supposed to be putting away with, okay? Because it shouldn't even be named among us as is fitting for saints, okay? And then what were the things we're supposed to do? Is for the fruit of the Spirit in verse 9 is in all goodness, righteousness, and truth. And I had to point out the fruit of the Spirit here, because we've been kind of looking at Galatians 5 a little bit as well. It says, "But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such there is no law." So those are the things that we looked at, that finding out what is acceptable to the Lord. Because again, we're walking as children of light, that we saw in verse 8. And verse 10, where we left off last week, is finding out what is acceptable to the Lord. The fruit of the Spirit is some of it, but as we go through the book of Ephesians, we're going to see those things that are acceptable to the Lord and those things that are not. Okay, so let's jump into verse 11. And it says, "And have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather expose them." Okay, and this is what we saw in verse 7. "Do not be partakers with them," because fellowship with the unfruitful fellowship means an accomplice in this thing. In other words, don't join in to the sin, okay? Don't be partakers with them like we saw in verse 7, and don't be an accomplice to the fact with the unfruitful. And unfruitful here means barren. Basically, it means it serves no purpose. It's devoid of productivity, right? It's contributing nothing to instruction, improvement, or comfort of others. That's what unfruitful is here, and that's what darkness brings you, okay? Because we saw we were once darkness. Okay, I pointed this out last week, is that we weren't once in darkness, we were once contributing to the darkness, okay? And so that's why we don't want to be accomplices to the unfruitful works of darkness, because we don't want to be that darkness anymore. We want to be the light, okay? And the reason why I point this out is this verse kind of pops a little bit differently for you, possibly after looking at it in the context that I just read about us being in darkness. It says, this is Jesus speaking in Matthew chapter 6, and that will be your next reading assignment this week, is chapter 6, if you read chapter 5 last week. And it says, the lamp of the body is the eye. If therefore your eye is good, your whole body will be full of light. And you're kind of like, wait a minute, I thought the light came into the eye, right? But this is saying the light of the lamp of the body is the eye. If therefore your eye is good, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If therefore the light that is in you is darkness, how great is that darkness? So this is basically saying that's what we left behind. That's what we're not doing anymore. And so if our hearts have not changed, we're still in this darkness. This is the way what we're living, how we function. If we didn't make a true commitment to Christ, we are still in darkness. And how great is that darkness if you haven't really, especially if you're faking it. Okay, if you became a Christian or said you became a Christian and you're doing good and you're faking it, how great is that darkness because you think you're okay, right? And so we need to be committed to Christ. We need to be living for Christ so that we can be full of light, so that our whole body will be full of light. Okay, but rather expose them. And I got on a tangent last week, and I kind of want to carry on my tangent a little bit this week because it's something near and dear to my heart about this rather expose them. Okay, here Paul uses this term about in like 4 or 5 other locations in the Bible. Okay, this term exposed, and the one that, and before we go into this tangent that I went into about expose them, and I use the example of preaching to 2 specific people in the congregation because of their lifestyle last week when it wasn't for the whole congregation. The pastor singled out these 2 people and they never came back, okay? So that's what I spoke on last week, and so I want to talk, I guess to keep it in context, this lesbian couple was coming to church, and one of them was starting to get convicted. You could see the God moving in her life, and the other one was having, body posture says a lot, right? And you could see it. And so when this pastor came and preached this to them, they never came back. Because I guarantee you the one that didn't want to have nothing to do with it was the one that was probably telling the one that was starting to feel the conviction of God saying, see, they're no good. They're just judgmental. They don't love. They're this, they're that, and they never came back. Okay? And so I want to give justification, further justification on why I think expose them, but rather expose them is in a specific manner. Okay? And before we get there, leading into this, because the way I see it is that Paul uses it in, like I said, about 4 or 5 places. In 2 of the places, in Corinthians and in here, he's addressing the church body, okay? And the other 4 locations, he is addressing the Timothy and Titus in the pastoral epistles. And when you think about the context of those pastoral epistles, you will recognize the difference between the context here, even though the meaning is the same, because it's all about context, okay? And so, again, I want to point out where we were earlier. You saw me repeat sections of verse 16 over and over again in the past few weeks about being in unity, and the whole body does, each person does its part. Well, the verse right before that is, look there, it says, but speaking the truth in love may grow up in all things into him who is the head, Christ. And remember we saw, by what every joint supplies according to the effective working, think the Pinewood Derby if you don't recognize that yet, and by which every part does its share, causes growth, okay? And so speaking the truth in love, and this is where I'm trying to go with this idea of expose, okay? How many have heard this verse quoted at you or at someone or about someone in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 2? Preach the word, be ready in season and out of season. Convince, rebuke, exhort with all long-suffering and teaching, right? That rebuke, it seems like I have seen pastors and biblical scholars and YouTube pastor videos. I've seen too much where they focus on the rebuke. We got to rebuke sin. We got to do this with sin. We got to always address the sin. But the thing is, who is Paul writing to in this verse? Paul is writing to Timothy in this verse on sticking with the truth to fellow Christians, to mature Christians even, okay? And so in this passage right here, long-suffering, I want to get you, because I'm really trying to get through to you, there's a way to address sin in the church that is speaking the truth in love. And I try never to do it from the pulpit. I don't think I do it from the pulpit unless the scripture, the passage we're in, speaks to it. And that's why I want to speak to this today. Okay? It's convince, rebuke, exhort with long suffering. This is all patience. This is how we're supposed to do it. We're supposed to be ready with the word. We're supposed to be instant in season, out in season. How do you do that? You read the Bible. You know the Bible. If you don't read the Bible, you can't be instant in season and out of season. Convince, rebuke, and exhort with all patience. All hearers, every kind of patience. All patience. Every form of patience you can think of, all patience. And what does this patience mean here? This patience means in the Greek here is long-suffering, slowness in avenging wrongs. Okay? That is why, to me, you don't find two people in this congregation to preach a message at when you're supposed to be feeding the congregation, right? You don't stand on your high horse from the pulpit to say this unless it's biblical, right? I guess I'm kind of on a high horse a little bit, okay? Because that's where I see the problem is where we got to stand up and make a stand against sin. We got to make a stand for sin. Amen. Make a stand against sin. Stand for what's right. Do what's right. But don't sling it at others, and don't think that you need to correct them until it's time to correct them. Because in that situation, it should have been the pastor and the elders taking that person aside to speak with them, build a relationship. It doesn't have to be a public shaming on these people because they're just going to ignore it, right? And so slowness in avenging wrong. Okay, because what does Timothy or Paul continue in verses 3 and 4? And this is why that verse frustrates me when people don't keep it in context. Because context is so critical. Okay, because here's the next two verses. If you only hear the one verse, here's the next two verses. Who is he addressing? That's my point. Who is he addressing when he says rebuke? Right? Who is he addressing? He's not addressing those that haven't even come to Christ yet. He's addressing the church body that should know better. Because look at this. For the time will come when they, the church, will not endure sound doctrine, but according to their own desires, because they have itching ears, they will heap up for themselves teachers, and they will turn their ears away from truth and be turned aside to fables. Okay? That's what happens when you sway from the truth. That is what goes wrong when you sway from the truth. Don't be afraid to say it's wrong, right, or indifferent, but make sure it's in the right context. Make sure it's to the body, not to the two people that are probably saved in your congregation and you're going to speak to them. No, the church is for the believers. We need some salvation mentioned in sermons, and I try to bring that up, but the church is for the believers. Okay? And then continuing on, it says that therefore, so again, but rather expose them. So I'm hoping I did a decent job of explaining how even the passage in Titus, there's another like passage in Titus, and it's in a section of, again, they're speaking to the believers. Paul's addressing to Titus to speak to the believers in this way. And it's not about the ones that are coming in off the street. The passage in Corinthians is talking about they will be convicted by your behavior, not by the word that you preach. So they talk about, it's all about speaking in tongues. It says if you do that, they're going to come in and think you're wacko. Okay? But if you prophesy, if you speak Jesus, if you talk Jesus, they're going to be convicted by you speaking Jesus. Okay? And so that's the context that we have for expose, is that we need to address the church, but also expose when the time is right in love, okay, and long suffering, okay, slow to avenge wrongs. Okay? Why? For it is shameful even to speak of those things which are done by them in secret. Okay? So again, if you keep this in context where I'm trying to say that he's addressing believers and not necessarily unbelievers, is that these things would be shameful to talk about if believers were doing this and thinking it was okay. There's a recent denomination that has a big split going on because they are allowing homosexuality in the church, even in the clergy, okay? And that church is split, big divide. It is shameful what's going on. What's in public is shameful what's going on. It shouldn't even be spoke about because we shouldn't have even had to go there. Okay? Because those things which are done by them in secret. Okay? Then continuing on, it says in verse 13, but all things that are exposed are made manifest by the light, for whatever makes manifest is light. Here's again, exposed, made manifest, is made visible. visible. So that's the thing, our life, our witness, the way we talk, the way we walk, that is what's going to make visible the light by which we are speaking, right? Because whatever makes manifest, or whatever makes visible is light. Okay? And so it's not to grab the Bible, you get a bigger Bible so you can do more damage, right? That's kind of the mentality people have. No, we need to operate in love. We need to show love to people, but still stand for what is right. It says in verse 14, therefore he says, awake you who sleep, arise from the dead, and Christ will give you light. Okay, if you love studying the Bible like I do and people's opinions, there's a lot of opinions about this because the reason why it attracts me is it's a quote. Paul is stating a quote here, and usually when there's a quote, it's to the Old Testament. Well, the problem is you can't find a quote like this exactly in the Old Testament, okay? And so the bottom line is what they have found out, they have a lot of ideas. It's in Isaiah, it's in this, it's here. Bottom line is that Paul is quoting an unknown source. And he's saying that he's quoting an unknown source that is basically speaking the word of God. Okay? Because he, uppercase he, is speaking of God, says, awake you who sleep, arise from the dead, and Christ will give you light. Okay? And so, again, I want to show something that I found in, I kind of reworded it. I need to give credit to Contending for the Faith commentary, but I wrote it in a little bit in my own words because I didn't fully agree with them, okay? So I don't know if that's plagiarism or not, but I'm claiming that where I stole it from. So is it still plagiarism? Okay, it says, God is here calling out the spiritually dead, desiring that they respond to his voice and come out of the domain of death. This same imagery is used by Jesus in John 5:25. A spiritually dead man can hear and respond to the gospel as these passages indicate he can. God calls to the spiritually dead through the gospel. Those who obey God will save. That's in Hebrews and Acts. But here's John 5:25. Again, Christ speaking. Most assuredly, I say to you, the hour is coming and now is when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. That's why we are speaking to the church. That's why I preach to the church. We evangelize, we witness, we show our life to others, but the church is to learn of God, right? Okay, and so continuing on is that in verse 15 we see then that you walk circumspectly, not as fool, but as wise, redeeming the time because the days are evil. Okay, see then that you walk circumspectly. Trying to find a good way to explain this, and the best I could come up with is project oversight. Anybody have project management experience? I know I'm a geek and I come from a different world. Okay, project management, everything you want to get done, you can make a project around. Okay, and it's a whole industry. Project management is a whole industry, and you have this idea of project oversight, and that's what this circumspectly is trying to say. That's what this idea is that have an oversight of everything you do. Keep in mind everything you do. Pay attention to what you do. Be mindful of what you do. Pay attention. Don't just live your life off the cuff. Function in life like you have a purpose, because our purpose for Christ is to win souls. Okay? And then it says, not as fools, but as wise. So in other words, don't be stupid, right? Redeeming the time because the days are evil. And I struggle a little bit with this one because redeeming doesn't really, in this case, it is an accurate use of the word. Let me say that. But there's a spin on the definition that you're not used to seeing. I'll put it that way. It's saying make most of the time because the days are evil. That's what redeeming the time. Make the most of the time. So I like to say that this is a reason why you should be an optimist and not a pessimist, right? Redeeming the time. Make the most of your time, because if you see your glass is half empty, then put it in a smaller glass, right? Don't be one of those ones that always see what you don't have. Be the one that's always seeing what you do have, because we have so much in Christ. So much. We are blessed, not just spiritually, and emotionally and mentally, but physically, right? There's just so many things where Christians are blessing each other on the things they do for each other, and it's a good life. Being a Christian is a good life, even when we suffer, even when we have struggles, right? Okay, so then I want to review and summarize these 4 verses, or 5 verses. So, verse 11 we saw, do not partake with the useless works of darkness, but refute them. And again, this refute, again, is, I like refute better than rebuke, because refute to me means that you're living by example and you address it. It's like a response. Remember, okay, I'll give an example. When I said be kind, I said it was the initiation of an action, not the response to an action. That's the same idea here on this refute. You're not initiating the action, you're responding to the action, if that makes sense. If you see something and somebody says it openly or says something to you that is against the word, then you can tell them. You can speak the truth in love. But it's not to go out there and say, boy, I'm going to take my Bible out on the street corner and see who I can pick on because they need this more than I do. That's not what we're doing, okay? And so again, I hope I'm making it clear. We don't agree with the sin, but there's a way to address the sin, and that's the key. We have to speak the truth in love. Okay, it's bad to speak of these works that are being done in secret in verse 12. The light of Christ exposes these works. And then Paul in verse 14 uses an unknown quote to use the source of the light is Christ, because Christ is that light. And then verse 15, be wise and pay attention to how you live. And then in verse 16, it is make the most of your time in this evil age. Okay? And that leads me to my so what. It says we should not waste our time on the pointless works of the world, which is darkness. We need to properly expose them in the body, that is the church. Be smart and make the most of our time in these evil days. Okay? And then with the point to ponder, it says, are there any pointless works in your life? What can you do now to make the most of your time for Christ? And I'm not saying you can't go fishing or you can't go crafting or you can't join the Women's Craft Day. We can enjoy life. God has given us things to enjoy life, but pointless. What serves no purpose when in our walk with Christ, okay? What is useless? What is not gaining anybody? Because I'll tell you what, even the Women's Craft Day, I've come through here after lunch sometimes seeing them, and they're laughing and carrying on, and there's some people there, I don't know if they're all Christians or not, but there's people that aren't coming to church, and they're having a good time. That's fruitful, right? Because we're opening the church doors for people to come in and do stuff. They're having fun. They're having a good time. They're showing the love of Christ by their joy and their fellowship. And those that aren't saved that come to that, they're going to be exposed to that, okay? And so that's a good example, okay? And then for next week, continue memorizing Ephesians 5, 8 through 10. And then read Matthew chapter 6, okay? And then next week, I will have a Father's Day sermon. I have one that I really like. It really spoke a lot to me when I came up with it, and so I want to share it. So we'll do that next week, and then we'll be back with Ephesians the week after that. And we'll be back on track for Ephesians, the next part of the verses. So have that in mind. And